You'd think planning a wedding would be the happiest time of my life, right? That's what I thought too. I pictured everything perfect, me in a beautiful white dress, Jonathan looking like the man of my dreams, and all our friends and family smiling as we said, "I do." But, of course, life had other plans. Let me tell you about my sister, Michelle. She's younger than me by 5 years, and we've never been close. Honestly, I don't know if she's ever really liked me. Growing up, she was the quiet, artsy one who never followed any rules, while I did everything by the book. I think our parents liked it that way, me as the responsible one, her as the creative one. But the truth is, she's always had this way of pulling people to her. People love her, even when she's barely trying. And, well, it's hard not to feel second place next to someone like that. So when I got engaged to Jonathan, I thought, finally. This is my moment. Jonathan is everything I ever wanted, steady, kind, thoughtful. The kind of guy you just know is going to be a great husband and father. And he loves me. Or at least, I thought he did. The first time I noticed something weird was at our engagement party. Michelle came, which surprised me because she usually skips family stuff. I don't know, she just seemed to stand out in a way that made me uncomfortable. Jonathan kept chatting with her, asking about her work and some trips she'd taken. It felt like he was more interested in her stories than celebrating us. I brushed it off, but it stuck in my head like a thorn. Then, at Thanksgiving, things got worse. Every time Michelle spoke, Jonathan was all ears. He laughed at her jokes, even the dumb ones. He asked about her art and her new projects. Meanwhile, I was sitting there, feeling like I could have been a piece of furniture for all he noticed. The worst part? She barely even tried. She wasn't dressed fancy or acting flirty. She was just Michelle. And for some reason, that seemed to be enough. I tried to tell myself it didn't mean anything, that I was just stressed with all the wedding planning. But it kept eating at me. I started paying attention to the little things, how Jonathan's face lit up when Michelle walked into a room, how he went out of his way to talk to her. It was like I wasn't even there. Finally, I snapped. One night, as we were going through the guest list, I asked him, "Do you think Michelle's bringing a date?" He shrugged and said, "I don't know. I hope she does. I'd love to see her happy." That hit me like a punch to the gut. "Why do you care if she's happy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Jonathan looked confused. "She's your sister. Don't you?" I wanted to scream, no. Not when her happiness makes me feel invisible. But instead, I just changed the subject and pretended I didn't care. But I did care. More than I wanted to admit. And the more I thought about it, the angrier I got, not just at Jonathan, but at Michelle too. She didn't even try to be part of my life most of the time, but here she was, stealing the spotlight at every turn. I started wondering if she even realized what she was doing. Maybe it was on purpose. By Christmas, I couldn't hold it in anymore. We were having dinner at my parents' house, and I swear, Jonathan barely spoke to me all night. Instead, he spent the whole time talking to Michelle about some photography trip she'd taken. It was like I didn't even exist. That night, after everyone went to bed, I cornered him in the guest room. "Do you have feelings for her?" I blurted out, my voice shaking. Jonathan stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "What?" "Emily, no. Where is this coming from?" "You're always looking at her," I said, tears stinging my eyes. "You laugh at her jokes, ask about her life. You never look at me like that anymore." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "She's your sister. I'm just trying to be nice because I know how much family means to you." "Family?" "Yeah, right. My family had always made me feel like I didn't belong, like I was only there to follow the rules and keep everything together. And now, Jonathan, my Jonathan, was doing the same thing. We argued for hours, going around in circles. He swore nothing was going on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By the time we went to bed, I was exhausted and more confused than ever. That's when I made up my mind. Michelle was the problem. She'd always been the problem. And if I wanted my wedding to be perfect, I had to do something about it. After that Christmas fight with Jonathan, I couldn't stop thinking about Michelle. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Every time I pictured Jonathan laughing with her or asking about her trips, my stomach churned. It was my wedding, my time, and somehow, she'd managed to steal the spotlight without even trying. I spent days going back and forth in my head. Should I confront her? Would that make things worse? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't just let it slide. If I didn't do something, she'd keep showing up, acting like she belonged at the center of everything, while I was left scrambling to hold it all together. So, I decided to take control. One evening, I called her. My hands were shaking, but I was determined. When she picked up, her voice was casual, like she wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. That made me even angrier. "Hey, Michelle," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to talk." She hesitated, probably because I never call her for anything. "Okay, what's up?" I took a deep breath. "I don't think you should come to the wedding." Silence. "Then, what?" Her tone was sharp, like I'd slapped her through the phone. "I just think it's better if you're not there," I said quickly. "You've been a distraction, and it's been hard for me to focus on what's important. I need this day to be about Jonathan and me, not," I stopped short, not wanting to say her name again. "Not anyone else." "You're joking," she said flatly. "I'm not." Her laugh was bitter. "You think I'm trying to ruin your wedding? Is that what this is about?" I clenched my jaw, trying to keep calm. "You know how Jonathan gets around you. It's like you've got this hold over people without even trying. I just can't deal with it on my wedding day." "Oh my God, Emily," she snapped. "That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I haven't done anything to you, and now you're banning me from your wedding because of your own insecurities?" "It's not about insecurities," I shot back, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "It's about boundaries." "Boundaries?" she repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You're unbelievable." "Fine. Don't worry, I won't be there. You can have your perfect little day without me." She hung up before I could say another word. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the phone in my hand. I'd expected her to argue more, to try to explain herself, but her anger threw me off. It wasn't like I wanted to fight with her, I just needed her to understand. But she didn't. She never did. When I told Jonathan what I'd done, he looked at me like I'd grown another head. "You banned your own sister from the wedding?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "I had to," I said, trying to make him see reason. "She's been making everything harder." "For who?" he asked, his eyebrows furrowing. "You? Or her?" "For both of us," I snapped. "Jonathan, I just want a stress-free wedding." "Is that so much to ask?" He shook his head, rubbing his temples. "I don't even know what to say, Emily. This feels wrong. She's your family." "She hasn't acted like it," I shot back. "She's barely been around for years, and now she wants to waltz in and act like she's the center of everything?" Jonathan didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost tired. "This isn't about Michelle. It's about you. You're so caught up in trying to control everything that you're pushing people away." "People like who?" I asked, crossing my arms. "Like me," he said, looking me dead in the eye. That stopped me cold. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm trying to support you, Emily, but you're making it really hard. Banning your sister, picking fights, accusing me of things that aren't even true, it's too much." I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came out. Instead, I just stared at him, my chest tightening. Was he serious? After everything I was doing to make this wedding perfect, he was blaming me? He sighed and stood up, heading toward the door. I need some air. Jonathan, wait, but he was already gone. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying everything over and over in my head. Was he right? Was I being too controlling? No. I couldn't let myself think like that. If I didn't hold it together, who would? Michelle? Yeah, right. Still, the weight of his words hung heavy over me. I'd wanted to fix things, to make the wedding perfect, but somehow it felt like everything was falling apart. The tension between Jonathan and me didn't ease after that night. If anything, it got worse. He became distant, spending long hours out of the house with vague explanations like, I'm meeting a friend, or, just need to clear my head. Every time he left, I felt that tight knot of anxiety growing in my chest. I tried to focus on the wedding planning, but it wasn't the same. Picking out flowers and seating arrangements felt meaningless when I couldn't shake the feeling that Jonathan was slipping away from me. And then there was Michelle, her angry words still echoed in my head. Maybe I had gone too far, but she didn't understand what it was like, always feeling second best, even on the one day that was supposed to be all about me. A week before the wedding, Jonathan came home late again. I was waiting for him in the living room, still in my pajamas, nursing a cup of tea I hadn't even touched. When he walked in, his face was pale, his shoulders slumped like he was carrying the weight of the world. Something in my gut told me this wasn't going to be good. Jonathan, I started, trying to keep my voice calm, we need to talk. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he dropped his keys on the counter and sat down on the edge of the couch, his head in his hands. The silence stretched on so long, I thought he might not say anything at all. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes tired and sad. I don't know if I can do this, Emily. I blinked, not sure I'd heard him right. What do you mean? He sighed, rubbing his temples like he was trying to figure out how to explain. I mean this, us. The wedding. Everything. I'm not sure I can go through with it. It felt like the floor dropped out from under me. You're calling off the wedding? My voice cracked on the last word, and I hated how small it sounded. I don't know, he admitted, his voice soft. I feel like we've lost something, Emily. The way you've been acting lately, the way you're so focused on making everything perfect, it feels like you're pushing me away. I'm pushing you away? I asked, my voice rising. Are you serious right now? I've been bending over backwards to plan this wedding, to make it everything we dreamed of, and now you're telling me you can't handle it? He shook his head, frustration flashing in his eyes. It's not about the wedding, Emily. It's about us. You've been so caught up in this idea of perfection that you don't even see what it's doing to you, or to me. I crossed my arms, trying to hold myself together. So this is my fault? You're the one who's been distant, who's been spending all your time out of the house, and now you're blaming me? I'm not blaming you, he said, his tone weary. I'm just trying to be honest. Something isn't right, Emily. It hasn't been for a while. And what about Michelle? I shot back. Is this about her? Because if you're trying to say. This isn't about Michelle, he interrupted, his voice sharp. Why can't you see that? She's not the problem, Emily. You are. His words hit me like a slap. I stared at him, my mouth opening and closing as I tried to come up with something to say. Finally, I managed, I'm the problem? After everything I've done for you, for us, you're telling me I'm the problem? Jonathan sighed again, his expression softening. Emily, I love you. I do. But the way things are right now, I don't know if it's enough. I don't know if we're enough. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My chest felt tight, my mind racing as I tried to process what he was saying. So what happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, he admitted. But I think we both need to take a step back and figure out what we really want. I stared at him, tears welling up in my eyes. Jonathan, the wedding is in a week. I know, he said quietly. And maybe that's why we need to figure this out now. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make him see how much he was hurting me. But all I could do was sit there, staring at him as the weight of his words settled over me. He stood up and walked toward the door, pausing just long enough to say, "I'm sorry, Emily. I really am." And then he was gone. I sat there for what felt like hours, the room spinning around me. How had it come to this? 1 week ago, I was obsessing over flower arrangements and table settings. Now, I wasn't even sure if there would be a wedding. And the worst part? Deep down, I couldn't help but wonder if he was right. The days after Jonathan's confession felt like I was living in a fog. The wedding was still scheduled, the guests were still coming, and the planners kept asking me to confirm last-minute details. But how could I plan for a wedding when the groom might not even show up? I told myself I'd give Jonathan space, that I wouldn't push him, but every minute felt like a ticking clock. It was the night before the rehearsal dinner when everything came crashing down. Jonathan had been spending a lot of time out of the house, and while I'd been trying to trust him, a small voice in the back of my mind kept whispering doubts. I told myself I wasn't going to snoop, I'm not that kind of person, but when I walked into our bedroom and saw his bag sitting open on the bed, I couldn't stop myself. At first, I was just tidying up, folding the clothes he'd left haphazardly. But then I spotted an envelope tucked into one of the side pockets. It was thick, stuffed with papers or photos. My heart pounded as I pulled it out. I told myself it was nothing, probably receipts or travel brochures, but when I opened it, my hand started to shake. Inside were photos. Dozens of them. Most were of Michelle. The pictures weren't anything scandalous, just candid shots of her laughing, working on her art, or hiking in some picturesque location. They looked like they'd been taken by a professional photographer, the kind you'd find on social media. But what were they doing in Jonathan's bag? I flipped through the stack, my stomach twisting. Then, at the bottom of the pile, I found a handwritten note. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and unmistakably Jonathan's. It read, "Michelle, thank you for sharing these. Emily and I will treasure them forever." I sat down hard on the bed, my head spinning. What was this? Why would Jonathan have these photos of Michelle? And why was he writing her notes? The paranoia I'd been trying so hard to suppress came roaring back, louder than ever. I felt sick. Was this why he'd been so distant? Why he'd been avoiding me? Had I been right all along? I spent the rest of the night pacing the house, clutching the envelope like it might explode. I wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but I knew he wasn't home. He'd texted earlier to say he was staying at a friend's place to clear his head. That only made me angrier. What kind of fiancé bails on his bride the night before the rehearsal dinner? By morning, I was a mess. I barely slept, and when Jonathan walked through the door, looking sheepish and tired, I was ready to explode. But before I could get a word out, he stopped me. "Emily," he said, his voice calm but serious. "We need to talk." I folded my arms, glaring at him. "You think?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know you've been feeling off lately, and I want to explain." "Explain?" I snapped, holding up the envelope. "You mean this?" His eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked genuinely surprised. "Where did you?" "You left it in your bag," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "What is this, Jonathan? Why do you have all these photos of my sister? And what's with the note?" He hesitated, and for a second, I thought he might lie. But then he shook his head and said, "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" I demanded. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty damning." Jonathan sat down, motioning for me to do the same. I stayed standing, arms crossed, as he began to explain. "I've been talking to Michelle," he admitted. "But not for the reason you think. I was trying to plan a surprise for you." My stomach dropped. "What kind of surprise?" He reached for the envelope, pulling out one of the photos. It was a picture of Michelle and me as kids, standing in front of our old house. These, he said, holding up the photo, were supposed to be part of your wedding gift. I asked Michelle to help me put together a collection of memories, things from your childhood, your family, because I know how much they mean to you. I stared at him, my anger slowly deflating. You were, what? Making a scrapbook? Sort of, he said. I wanted it to be a surprise, something meaningful. I know you and Michelle haven't been close, and I thought maybe this would help bridge that gap. The weight of his words hit me like a freight train. All this time, I'd been so sure that something was going on between them, that Jonathan was hiding feelings from Michelle. But he'd been trying to bring us closer together. He wasn't pulling away, he was trying to pull us together. I started, but my voice cracked. I thought you liked her. Jonathan looked at me, his expression soft but pained. Emily, I love you. Only you. But your insecurities, this need to control everything, it's getting in the way. I've been trying to help, but it feels like no matter what I do, it's not enough. Tears welled up in my eyes. For the first time, I didn't know what to say. All the paranoia, the accusations, the fights, it had all been for nothing. And now, I was standing on the edge of losing the one person I thought I could count on. The morning of the rehearsal dinner, everything felt off. Jonathan and I hadn't spoken much since his explanation about the photos. He'd given me space, but it didn't feel like the kind of space that helps, it felt like the kind that grows into a chasm. Still, I plastered on a smile and pretended like everything was fine. The guests were arriving, the venue was coming together, and I had a schedule to keep. That was the thing about weddings, once the ball started rolling, there was no stopping it. Even if the bride felt like she might crumble. The rehearsal dinner was meant to be a cozy gathering, just family and the bridal party. I'd hoped it would calm my nerves, but instead, it only made them worse. My parents were bustling around, fussing over every detail, while Jonathan seemed detached, like he was only half there. I couldn't stop glancing at him, trying to read his expression, but he avoided my eyes. And then there was the empty chair. Michelle wasn't there, of course. I'd made sure of that. But now, as I looked at the space where she should have been, I felt a pang of guilt. Jonathan had been right, my obsession with controlling everything had pushed people away, even the people who were supposed to matter most. For the first time, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. Halfway through the dinner, Jonathan stood up to make a toast. He tapped his glass, smiling politely as the room quieted down. I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight, he began. It means a lot to Emily and me to have all of you with us as we start this new chapter. He paused, his eyes scanning the room, and for a moment, I thought he was looking for Michelle. My heart twisted, but then he continued. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to get married, he said. About promises and honesty and what it takes to make something last. There was a shift in his tone, something heavier, and my stomach dropped. I gripped the edge of the table, suddenly terrified of what he might say next. Emily, he said, turning to me, you're an incredible person. Strong, determined, passionate. I fell in love with you because of those qualities. But over the past few weeks, I've started to realize something. The room was silent, every pair of eyes on us. I could feel my parents stiffen beside me, could see my maid of honor shift uncomfortably in her chair. Jonathan took a deep breath. I don't think I can do this. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. But then I saw the look on his face, sad, resolute, and I knew he meant it. What? I managed, my voice barely a whisper. He reached for my hand, but I pulled it away. Emily, I'm so sorry, he said, his voice trembling. But I can't marry you. Not like this. The room erupted into murmurs and gasps, but I barely heard them. My ears were ringing, my chest tight as I struggled to process what was happening. Jonathan, I said, my voice shaking, this isn't the time for this. We can talk about it later. No, he said gently. We need to talk about it now. I love you, but something isn't right between us. I think we've both been ignoring it because we're scared of what it means. But I can't stand up there tomorrow and make promises I'm not sure I can keep. Tears spilled down my cheeks, but I couldn't bring myself to wipe them away. So that's it? I asked, my voice breaking. You're just going to walk away? After everything we've been through? I'm not walking away, he said. I'm being honest. For both of us. The murmurs grew louder, my parents whispering furiously to each other. My dad started to stand, but I waved him off. No, I said firmly, though my voice trembled. This is between us. Jonathan nodded, his face etched with sadness. I never wanted to hurt you, Emily. But I can't pretend anymore. Before I could respond, there was a sudden commotion at the back of the room. Heads turned, and I followed their gaze to see Michelle standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She wasn't supposed to be here, she wasn't even invited. But there she was, like a ghost from my past, ready to haunt me all over again. What's going on? She asked, stepping forward. Her eyes darted between me and Jonathan, her brow furrowed. Why does it sound like the wedding's off? Michelle, this isn't your business, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. But Jonathan shook his head. No, she deserves to know. He turned to her, and the way he looked at her made my heart ache. It wasn't love or desire, it was something else. Something I couldn't quite place. Michelle, he said, I'm sorry. I know this must be awkward for you, but I can't marry Emily. Not when things are this complicated. Complicated, she repeated, her voice rising. What's that supposed to mean? It means, I snapped, that he's been spending more time worrying about you than about me. Michelle froze, her eyes widening. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about, I said, the anger bubbling up before I could stop it. All those conversations, the photos, the notes, you've been in the middle of everything, haven't you? Her face hardened. Emily, you've got this all wrong. Do I? I shot back. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been trying to ruin my life. Enough. Jonathan's voice cut through the chaos, silencing both of us. This isn't about Michelle. It's about us, Emily. And it's about time we started being honest with ourselves. I stared at him, my chest heaving, my mind spinning. For a moment, I thought I might faint. But then the reality set in, he was serious. The wedding was over. And everything I'd been fighting to hold on to was slipping through my fingers. I don't know how I made it through the rest of the evening. After Jonathan's bombshell and Michelle's sudden appearance, I felt like I was standing in the middle of a storm, everything spinning out of control. People were staring, whispering, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My parents were furious, my friends were confused, and Jonathan, he looked like he was carrying the weight of the world. I wanted to scream, to cry, to grab him and make him take it all back. But I couldn't do anything except stand there, frozen, as the life I'd spent months building fell apart in front of me. Eventually, people started leaving. My mom tried to talk to me, but I shook her off. Not now, I muttered, barely able to look her in the eye. My dad gave Jonathan a look that could have melted steel, but he didn't say a word. Even Michelle left quietly, her face a mix of guilt and confusion. By the time I got home, the silence was deafening. The house felt emptier than it ever had, and I hated it. I hated every part of it, the half-finished seating chart on the kitchen table, the unopened wedding favors stacked neatly in the corner, the stupid countdown calendar I'd been marking with little hearts for weeks. It all felt like a cruel joke now. I sat on the floor in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the remnants of what should have been the happiest time of my life. My dress was hanging in the corner, carefully wrapped in its protective cover. I stared at it, my chest tightening with every breath. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. I'd done everything right. I'd planned every detail, made every sacrifice, and yet here I was, alone, humiliated, and completely lost. The tears came slowly at first, then all at once. I cried until my throat was raw and my head ached. I cried for the wedding that wouldn't happen, for the fiancé who didn't want me anymore, and for the sister I'd pushed away because I couldn't handle my own insecurities. It felt like everything I'd been holding inside was pouring out all at once, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up hours later to the sound of my phone buzzing. I fumbled for it, my eyes blurry from crying, and saw a message from Michelle. "We need to talk. Please." I almost ignored it. The last thing I wanted was another confrontation, especially with her. But something stopped me. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the faintest glimmer of hope that she might actually have something helpful to say. Either way, I texted her back. "Fine. Tomorrow." When morning came, I was still a wreck. My eyes were puffy, my hair was a mess, and I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. But I forced myself to get dressed and meet Michelle at a coffee shop downtown. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, an apology, maybe, or at least an explanation for why she'd shown up uninvited. But when I walked in and saw her sitting there, her face pale and drawn, I realized she looked just as broken as I felt. "Thanks for coming," she said quietly as I sat down. I didn't respond, just crossed my arms and waited for her to start. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "Emily," she began, "I don't even know where to start. I never wanted things to get this bad between us. I swear, I wasn't trying to ruin anything." I scoffed. "Could have fooled me." Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for the first time, I saw something I didn't expect: hurt. "Do you really think I'd do that to you?" she asked, her voice cracking. "You're my sister." I wanted to snap back, to tell her exactly what I thought, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I said, "If that's true, then why does it always feel like you're trying to take everything away from me?" Michelle looked at me for a long moment, then shook her head. "Emily, that's not me. That's something you've been carrying for years, and I don't know how to fix it." Her words hit me harder than I wanted to admit. Maybe she was right. Maybe I'd been holding on to resentment for so long that I didn't know how to let it go. But that didn't mean I was ready to forgive her. "You showed up last night," I said, my voice shaking. "You knew you weren't invited." "Why?" Michelle hesitated, then said, "Because I overheard Mom and Dad talking. They were worried about you, and I thought maybe I could help." "Help?" I laughed bitterly. "By barging in and making everything worse?" She flinched but didn't look away. "I didn't know Jonathan was going to say all that," she admitted. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The anger I'd been holding onto for so long was still there, but it felt different now. Smaller, somehow. Like it was running out of steam. Finally, I sighed. "I don't know what to do anymore," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Everything's falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it." Michelle reached across the table, her hand resting on mine. "Maybe you don't have to fix it," she said softly. "Maybe you just need to figure out what you really want." I stared at her, my chest tightening. I didn't know what I wanted. All I knew was that the perfect life I'd been trying so hard to build wasn't so perfect anymore. The day after my meeting with Michelle, I couldn't stop replaying our conversation in my head. Her words lingered, about how I didn't have to fix everything, about figuring out what I really wanted. It felt like she'd cracked open a door I didn't even know was there, but I was too scared to step through it. The wedding was officially off. Jonathan texted me that morning, confirming what I already knew but hadn't wanted to admit. He said he cared about me, but he couldn't marry someone who wasn't ready to face her own fears and insecurities. His words stung, but deep down, I couldn't argue with them. The rest of the week passed in a blur. Canceling vendors, calling guests, and facing my parents' wrath was a nightmare, but it also felt like penance. My mom couldn't stop asking what had happened, while my dad mostly just shook his head in disappointment. They didn't understand, and I didn't have the energy to explain. I spent a lot of time alone after that. The house felt emptier than ever without Jonathan there, and every room was a reminder of what could have been. I found myself sitting in the living room, staring at my wedding dress, still hanging in its protective cover. I'd been so sure that dress was the key to a perfect life, but now it just felt like a hollow symbol of everything I'd lost. One night, a few days after the canceled wedding, I got another text from Michelle. "Can I come over?" I hesitated for a long time before responding. I wasn't sure I was ready to face her again, but something in me said yes. When she arrived, she looked nervous, almost shy. She held a small box in her hands, which she placed on the table between us without saying a word. "What's this?" I asked, eyeing it suspiciously. "Just open it," she said quietly. I lifted the lid and found a stack of photos. The same ones Jonathan had collected for his surprise gift, the candid shots of Michelle and me as kids, family vacations, silly moments we'd both forgotten. At the bottom of the stack was a note, written in Michelle's handwriting. "I know we've never been close, but I want to try. You're my sister, and I don't want to lose you." My throat tightened as I read the words. I looked up at her, tears welling in my eyes. "You didn't have to do this," I said softly. "Yes, I did," she replied. "You're not the only one who's been holding on to things, Emily. I've spent years feeling like I didn't belong in this family, like I was the odd one out. And maybe I am, but that doesn't mean I don't care about you." I stared at her, her words sinking in. For the first time, I realized that the wall between us wasn't just built by me. We'd both been carrying so much baggage from our childhood, so many unspoken feelings, and it had all come to a head in the worst possible way. "I'm sorry," I said, the word surprising even me. "For blaming you. For everything." Michelle smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "I'm sorry too. For not being there when you needed me." We sat in silence for a while after that, flipping through the photos and reminiscing about the moments we still remembered. It wasn't perfect, there was still a lot left unsaid, but it felt like a start. Over the next few weeks, things slowly began to settle. I started seeing a therapist, something I'd been putting off for years. It was hard, talking about my fears, my need for control, my insecurities, but it was also freeing. For the first time, I felt like I was starting to understand myself. Jonathan reached out once, about a month after the canceled wedding. He wanted to meet for coffee, to talk. Part of me was terrified, but I agreed. When we met, he looked different, more relaxed, lighter somehow. We talked about everything, the wedding, our relationship, the mistakes we'd both made. He didn't sugarcoat anything, and neither did I. By the end of the conversation, it was clear that we still cared about each other, but we weren't right together. Not anymore. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said as we parted ways. "You too," I replied, and for the first time, I meant it. Michelle and I kept in touch, texting and meeting up every now and then. It wasn't an instant fix, we had years of distance and misunderstandings to work through, but we were trying. That was more than I'd ever thought possible. And me? I started focusing on myself. On figuring out what I wanted, not what I thought everyone else expected of me. It wasn't easy, but it felt like the first real step I'd taken in a long time. Life didn't magically fix itself after the wedding fell apart, but it started to feel manageable. For the first time in years, I wasn't constantly chasing perfection or worrying about what everyone thought of me. I focused on my job, went to therapy, and even started journaling, something I hadn't done since high school. Slowly, I was beginning to feel like a person again. Michelle and I continued to rebuild our relationship, step by step. She invited me to one of her art shows, and I actually went. At first, it was awkward, I didn't know anyone, and her world felt so different from mine. But watching her work on display, seeing how proud and confident she looked, I felt something I hadn't expected, pride. She wasn't just my sister anymore, she was someone I genuinely admired. And Jonathan? We stayed friendly, but distant. We'd check in occasionally, but the conversations were short and polite, like two people who had once been close but had grown into strangers. I thought that chapter of my life was fully behind me. Until I missed my period. At first, I didn't think much of it. Stress can do that, right? But when another week passed, and then another, I started to worry. My chest felt heavy, my stomach churned, and I couldn't shake the nagging thought in the back of my mind. I finally caved and bought a pregnancy test, my hands shaking as I stared at the little box on my bathroom counter. It only took a few minutes, but it felt like hours. When I saw the tiny plus sign, my world tilted. I was pregnant. I sat on the bathroom floor, staring at the test in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Jonathan and I hadn't been together for over a month, but I knew the timing added up. There was no question, this was his baby. For days, I kept it to myself. I didn't tell Michelle, I didn't call Jonathan, and I definitely didn't tell my parents. I wasn't ready for the questions, the opinions, or the judgments. I needed time to figure out what this meant, not just for me, but for the life growing inside me. When I finally called Jonathan, my hands were trembling so much I almost dropped the phone. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm but cautious. "Emily? Is everything okay?" "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to see you." We met at a park near his apartment, a quiet spot with a little pond and lots of trees. He looked nervous when he saw me, like he was bracing for bad news. I guess he wasn't wrong. "Emily," he said as I sat down next to him on a bench. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, my fingers gripping the edge of the bench. "I'm pregnant," I said quickly, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess myself. He froze, his eyes wide as he stared at me. "What?" "I'm pregnant," I repeated, my voice steadier this time. "And it's yours." For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at me like he was trying to process what I just said. Finally, he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I said. "I've done the math, and there's no doubt. It's yours." He leaned back, his gaze shifting to the pond in front of us. "Wow," he said softly. "That's a lot to take in." "I know," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, too. But I thought you deserved to know." "Thank you," he said, his voice full of emotion. "I'm glad you told me." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the situation settling over us. Finally, Jonathan turned to me, his expression serious but kind. "What do you want to do, Emily?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm still figuring that out. But whatever happens, I want you to be part of it. If you want to be." His face softened, and for a moment, I saw the man I'd fallen in love with, the man who always wanted to do the right thing. "Of course I want to be part of it," he said. "This is our child. We'll figure it out together." His words were comforting, but they didn't erase the fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. This wasn't how I'd imagined my life would turn out. No wedding, no happy ending, just me and Jonathan trying to make sense of something we never planned for. In the weeks that followed, we started talking more, about the baby, about our future, about how to navigate this new reality. It wasn't easy, and it definitely wasn't perfect, but it was something. And through it all, Michelle was there, quietly supporting me in her own way. She didn't try to fix things or tell me what to do, she just listened. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't alone. As the months passed, I realized something: life doesn't always go the way you plan, and that's okay. Sometimes, the messiest, most unexpected moments are the ones that teach you who you really are. And while I didn't have all the answers yet, I knew I'd figure it out. One step at a time.